All right, we are live. Thank you
Well,
everyone for joining us. Welcome. This is our second installment of The Future with FullCycle. This is our way of convening our community around big ideas, around big solutions, focused on everything we can and should be doing to solve the climate crisis. We're thrilled to have the opportunity to convene our folks, our community of investors, of activists, of friends who really believe in this mission and share it with us. And I'm super excited today to have this conversation with my favorite physicist, Dr. Marcelo Gleiser. My name is Stefan Nicolo. I'm a managing director and partner at FullCycle. FullCycle, we're investors in technology that will solve the climate crisis at scale. And we're serious about that. And we really like to have these conversations to bring our community forward and allow us to convene and think about the best ways we can do that and the technologies and the scientific data that allows us to be most effective at solving the climate crisis, our long emergency. Before we dive in, we've got a fantastic chat and conversation ahead of us today. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you, Marcelo. Let me introduce you to our audience. I hope you don't blush easily. So Dr. Marcelo Gleiser is a, is a theoretical physicist. He is a professor of natural philosophy, physics, and astronomy at Dartmouth College. He's the co-founder of an organization called 13.7, an active promoter of science in the general public, and is the 2019 Templeton Prize winner. The Templeton Prize is an award that's given to those who are living and harnessing the power of the sciences to explore the deepest questions of our meaning in the universe and our place and purpose within it. It is a really prestigious award that's been given to people like Mother Teresa, Desmond Tutu, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, physicists Freeman Dyson and Martin Rees. And I will say personally, I had the pleasure of watching you receive that award last year, Marcelo. It was a wonderful reception and well-deserved. And I'm so grateful that you're here to converse with us today. Thank you.
no, my pleasure. Absolutely. Thanks for that. Thanks for inviting me. And those of you listening, thanks for tuning in these strange and complicated times that we're living. But at least it gives us an opportunity to have a Zoom conversation with about 100 people at lunchtime, which is not something that usually happens in normal times. So there is some silver lining, at least, in what's going right now.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And I will say, you've got the right background for an academic. You look like you're in your office at Dartmouth College. and really grateful that you had the opportunity to get there and to join us today.
Yeah,
Before
basically had to, because my internet, believe it or not, I live about 8 miles from campus, but my internet is not as reliable as it should be, and I wanted to avoid problems. And the campus is completely desert, is a desert right now, so it gives us a chance to actually come in safely. Yeah.
Sure, sure. Well, before we dive in, I want to tell our audience who is listening today and who are dialed in that we're saving the questions for the end of our chat today. So if you click the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, please say your name, your organization. We'll select as many questions as we can fit in at the end of our discussion and hopefully be able to answer them for you. So our topic today is tribalism, right? We're talking about a concept you've written extensively about, Marcelo, tribalism in humanity, you know, the tendency for humans to coalesce in tribes and to be us versus them in mentality. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about what you mean and why that's even an important topic for big challenges like the climate crisis?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to unpack tribalism a little bit. So let's go back, say, 15, 20,000 years in time where there was no organized agriculture yet, right? So at that time, you had bands of hunter-gatherers, our ancestors, and they basically survived by organizing themselves in these groups that were defined by a system of values, the tribes, right? And that was extremely important for them, for their survival, because after all, being together as a tribe allowed people to protect one another, to gather food together, to share what they had, and also to avoid potential conflicts with other tribes by defending themselves. So immediately as you put yourself together as a group, two things happen. There are others who are not part of your group, and also the group itself has kind of an MO, has a way of operate that depends on what they believe in. Right. And that sort of organization was extremely important to our survival as a species, because otherwise, if you're everyone alone, we would probably not have survived all the predators that and all the problems with the climate. You had the ice age at the time as well. But that was very useful, and it has been part of our history ever since, that we always organize in groups. And you can think of this in a very broad sense, right? You can think of it as, what are the tribes that I belong to today? You can talk about, well, in a very kind of loose definition of what I mean by tribe, and that's very important. You can talk about your family, you can talk about your community, you can talk about the people you work with, you can talk about religious communities, sports communities. You believe in, I am a fan of the Red Sox, or I'm not. And then there's this sort of like, so sports in a sense are basically a reenactment of tribal disputes and alliances, right? So that we can kind of dilute a little bit our intensity as a species, combative species. So tribe has been everywhere, and the notion that you have the tribe of the liberals and the tribe of the conservatives, you have those that deny climate change and those that support and act to try to make some modifications on the way we think about climate change. You can think of them as tribes as well. And so this has been the way humanity has defined itself up to now, right? And why is that a problem nowadays? Well, because after about 150 years or so after the Industrial Revolution, what has happened is that with the development of not just industrial power, but also the exploitation of the environment, but also importantly, with the development of science itself, we came to understand who we are in this planet, our relationship to this planet and to the other living forms of this planet that we share with, and our place in the solar system, in the galaxy, in the universe, in a very, very different way, right? And so what we are confronted with, and I think the COVID-19 pandemic is a tragic but very clear illustration of what I mean, is that all these separate tribes that we've been fighting, that have been fighting against one another, all these different people that tear each other apart for such small things, have been exposed to their common and shared fragility. So right now, right? So right now, as a whole, we are not the liberals and the conservatives, or the religious or the atheists. We are the human species as a whole, fighting an invisible agent that is humbling us in its power to create desolation, sadness, market instability, and all sorts of dysfunctional behaviors that we are seeing, in our communities. So that is a wake-up call. And I think it's an opportunity. And that's what I would like to talk to you about later as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's the current crisis, I think you put it perfectly. It's a incredibly costly, incredibly tragic litmus test, right? For how well we've done at coming together to solve big problems. It's a litmus test for our systems, for what we've implemented and how we have allowed ourselves to support people through those systems, right? So things like healthcare, and energy, and power, education, all of these things are being tested in this moment. And I find kind of this lens of tribalism really interesting to think about what it is we can learn now for a much bigger challenge that we're facing in the climate crisis. And I'd love to know your thoughts kind of about that. What is it that we can learn in this moment that will enable us to have better global cooperation and better tools to face bigger challenges coming?
So here is a fundamental thing that the COVID-19 crisis has with the climate crisis. It's a global crisis. You know, wars are mostly local, even when you have a world war, right, which our generation sort of very fortunately escaped having a global conflict, you know, both the First World War and the Second World War, right? My grandparents, my parents lived through that. We didn't. Even the Cold War didn't have a huge potential nuclear conflict like it could have had, right? But right now, we are facing a global enemy, so to speak, right? No, so it's not this country versus that country or tribe versus tribe again, but it's really us against this very small life form. So, and that is something that is really unprecedented in the history of humanity, because even when you had pandemics in the past, say, well, the Spanish flu perhaps is one precedent that happened. So the flu of 1918 that did affect most countries in the world, and it was absolutely devastating. And I'm sure you people all know the numbers, but it's good to remember, you know, what these numbers were like, right? So the estimates for the Spanish flu of 1918 were about 50 million deaths. 50 million deaths and about 500 million contagions, right? So imagine that. And of course, in 1918, the population of the planet was 1/4 of what it is now, roughly, right? So that gives you a dimension, a scale of what was going on then. So with that exception, but then we didn't have the internet. It was much harder for news to travel across, for people to remain informed as fast and as effectively that we are now. Economy wasn't as globalized as it is now. Traveling wasn't as easy as it is now. And so the networking capabilities that we now have as a society kind of multiply the global connectedness and the fragility of us as a species much more, because we have the ability to go places and to touch people in a much more efficient way than we had before. So in that sense, what we are finding now with the COVID-19 is several things. First of all, that we must begin to think of ourselves as a single tribe. And that is really the sort of like the punchline of this whole tribal event. It is a tribe that includes differences, respects and celebrates diversity, but it is a single tribe of the humans in this planet. And that is essential for the climate crisis, because only when we understand that this is not just about rich countries and poor countries, it's really about us as a species trying to preserve an environment that is good to us in this planet. We are going to be able to be a little more effective about amplifying the need for a lot of people to change their mindset about what it is that climate change really means. So to me, the essential lesson, since we were asking about this, is that now we have an opportunity, right, to begin to change not just the minds of those that are listening to this, because, you know, you guys are all self-selected already. That's easy. Talking to you is easy. It is the real challenge is to amplify this conversation and to reach groups that do not listen to this, that would not know what FullCycle is, you know, that would think in a very different way, because it doesn't matter what they think, because they will be affected precisely in the same ways that we are all going to be affected. So there is this lack of separation, tribal separation, you know, which is essential when we start to deal with questions as big as and as globally impactful as climate change.
Agreed. It is the similarity between the two issues that it has made a unifying kind of it's put us all in the same boat. We are all stakeholders in what happens next, both for this very acute crisis and then for climate change. And I think, for us, as an organization, the question is, well, what role does the private sector play in helping us get to solutions and helping us address the climate crisis in a really meaningful way? And, it's funny because what we're seeing now is what I think we'll see, and what we're beginning to see for climate change as well, which is the role of the private sector now changes. The roles of government now changes so that we can orient ourselves towards this collective, potentially existential threat that we're all facing. And, that's been an interesting component for us to say, hey, like there's a way for us to be really effective about where we deploy capital, about what we choose to fund and build, and the urgency with which we do it. And I really appreciate your frame because it allows us to give kind of the broadest audience the charge of taking a responsibility and a role in shaping solutions and in addressing this really big problem.
So to me, the biggest challenge that your organization and others would face is really rooted very deeply in our historical mindset. And really is about the changing of mindsets. I think that is, to me, the biggest challenge. I mean, because if you think about it, the message of climate change is being repeated, by scientists, very reputable people for decades now. But it is affecting, unfortunately, still a very small number of people that matters, Right. So what is going on? Right. And there are many, many variables on this conversation. Of course, I wouldn't be, capable of, or I don't think a single human being could possibly address all of them. But I would like to address this one of the question of mindset, because I think it's really important. I don't know if you noticed, since you are interested in investments, you notice that there is a meat shortage right now, right? And because there is a meat shortage, if you go and you look at the markets, beyond meat, the stocks are skyrocketing right now, right? Because they produce non-animal meat, so to speak, right? I mean, they produce burgers and different kinds of meat that really taste pretty much like meat does, but they're vegetarian, vegan. Right. So, and so Burger King is serving now vegetarian burgers, which is kind of amazing, right? And that to me is very revealing because it shows that there is the possibility of bigger companies that always were on the other side of the fence, to actually start to change their minds. And what I see with this is essentially the notion that once corporate ethics starts to realign itself with a global vision where the customer is not a target, but a partner. I think a lot of things have the potential to change. I don't know what's going on here. Sorry. It's right. Somebody,
it's live TV, no
somebody
worries.
butt calling me. Anyways. So apologies for that. So we, to me, and I'm going to give you an anecdotal example here, which is kind of funny, but actually good. Which is to me one of the barometers of American culture is the Super Bowl, and I wasn't born here, so for me soccer is much more interesting than American football. But I go and I always watch the Super Bowl, but not so much as for the game, but for the ads, for the commercials, because the commercials during Super Bowl, in a sense, are targeting a huge sector of the American population, right? And they're usually about what? Beer and trucks. I mean, a lot of them are about beer and trucks. Now, if you watch the Super Bowl this year, they were about beer and trucks and cars, but most of the commercials about cars and trucks were about electric cars and hybrid cars. And the biggest commercial about beer was, if I'm not mistaken, it was Miller saying that to each 6-pack of beer bought, they would pay for a farm to transition to organic farming. I was amazed by this because this to me is really showing sort of the potential of a large-scale change in the mindset of big corporations that actually are supposedly aligned with a lot of the American consumers in this case, right? And so there is promise there. But the mindset needs to change, because if it doesn't change, all the efforts are going to be of limited scope. And the global crisis is so huge, it's so gigantic, that we all need to work together as a species, the human hive, I call it, so that we recognize the importance of each one of us, so that each one of us has a function, from the people working in medical care right now, in healthcare, on the front lines, to the people that are keeping our streets clean, to the farmers that are still producing food. There is no food shortage. Otherwise, things will be pretty bad pretty quickly, right? Someone once said that social disruption is 9 meals away. If people don't eat for 3 days, it's going to be a big mess. So it's essential that we have that. But the mindset here is that it's not this group versus that group, is that we each perform a function in the human hive that is essential for the survival of the species. And within that, since I'm a scientist, I talk about what's called, what I see as the age of post-Copernicanism. And I want to explain what I mean by that, because I think that's important. As you remember, Copernicus was the guy who, in 1543, published a book saying that the sun is the center of the solar system and not the earth, right? And that was a major disruption of the worldview of most people in the 16th century, because, before, the earth was the center and everything revolved around us. We were the best, we're great, chosen by God in his image. So there was a whole way of thinking about who we were in the universe that was very much aligned with this notion of geocentrism. Then Copernicus comes and disrupts that, and nothing happens for about 50 years, and eventually Galileo and Kepler and Newton make this whole vision of Copernicanism important. And because of the success of science during 400 years, we have this notion that the Earth now is not the center. The Earth is a planet, right? Just like any other planet, not important at all, just a little cosmic piece of dust, right? And hence this sort of how can I put, casual way of thinking about our planet in the big scheme of things kind of percolated through thinking, and the whole industrialization of the earth, of society, made the earth into a commodity that could just be exploited. So this has been the mindset from the beginning of science with Copernicanism, the idea that nature, which is actually supported by a lot of religious thinking, the nature, that we are the owners of the natural world, that we can make use of it. That's actually in the beginning, Genesis, if you want to look at the Old Testament. And that percolated into a sort of like, I don't really care about the natural world. All I care about is the exploitation of the natural world.
Right.
Now, fast forward to 21st century, right? And to the discovery that the Earth is actually a very special kind of planet. That you look out there in the solar system, and yes, they're beautiful and spectacular, and I love and I study them, but they don't have what the Earth has, which is this incredible set of properties that allows for life to not just emerge here, but to survive for about 3.5 billion years, so that eventually, through a lot of mutations and environmental changes, our ancestors appeared about 200,000 years ago. Now, the Earth couldn't care less about us. The Earth has existed for 4.5 billion years. We just arrived, right? So if you put the clock of the age of the Earth, 4.5 billion years, into 24 hours, we just showed up fractions of a second before midnight. And if we disappear, the Earth is going to go on, right? Different life will appear, will adapt, So the point I'm trying to make is that what we have learned from modern astronomy, our new take on the way the universe actually operates and what kinds of planets and stars are out there, is that the Earth is a very rare planet. So kudos to Elon Musk and those who want to go to Mars. But the point is that we evolved in this planet and we are completely dependent on life and the environmental situation of this planet for our survival. And so we should be waking up to what I call a post-Copernican mindset, where we come back to the Earth and understand that, yes, there are trillions of other worlds out there in our galaxy alone, but this is our world, and we evolved in this world, and there is only one world. And it will be really very hard and science fiction-like to think about us colonizing other planets. You know, you're talking thousands of years ahead. Our problems are decades, not thousands of years ahead, the problems we have to face. And the only way to do that is to understand the centrality of our world and the importance of our species in this environment.
Yeah, I mean, I love it as both a mindset and a shift for how we think about ourselves in the universe and how we think about this very special place that, let's be honest, we're not going to leave in a meaningful way for, as you said, many thousands of years. And what it makes me think of is the role of science in everything that we have to establish or rebuild or think about, from the way corporations think about their actions, their operations, their footprint, to how we interact with the natural world around us. And I can say, you know, for us, we have built a firm based on very deep understanding of climate science, right? To understand our shared problem, we've got to understand the science in a really nuanced way. So here's a good example. A lot of folks will talk about global warming and they'll talk about CO2. And CO2 is, you know, it's a problem in the atmosphere, but it's a relatively weak gas and it's abundant in our biosphere. And so if you think about what actually is causing the problem, it is a small subset of greenhouse gases that have an outsized effect. We're calling them, or most scientists will call them, short-lived climate pollutants. Fancy name. What it means is methane and nitrous oxide and fluorinated gases. These are 20 to 24% of the gases we emit anthropogenically, but they cause 50% of the warming. And so I say this to say, you know, if we can mutually, collectively understand the science behind these problems, then we can start to develop solutions that point more acutely at the solutions that we can build together. And, you know, it's great to kind of see in academia and in your realm, kind of the focus on science as a centerpiece for everything we've got to build going forward. It's how we've built our investment thesis and how we invest. And so it's really great to kind of see it in other realms as well, because I think it's going to have to be a shared value, that science comes back. You said it last week, actually, and it struck me. You said we have to rescue science. And I think this is a moment where we can do that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, science has been attacked so much in the last few years because of this onslaught of propaganda against it, right? And I keep thinking about the race for the vaccine for COVID-19.
Sure.
And when it happens, because I am confident that it will happen, I would like to see the anti-vaccine people not vaccinating themselves and the kids, you know, say, yeah, no, I'm not taking this, you know, it's just, it's not good for you, right? And to me, that sort of is science on your face. Like, we absolutely depend on it for our quality of life. And to a very large extent, this whole revolution that we're talking about in terms of alternative fuels, I just had this idea that what we're doing is we're going from the inside of the earth to the outside of the earth. If you think about all the technology, or pretty much most of the technology for fossil fuels, is from stuff underground, right? It's all about the oil underground, the gas underground. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to transition from an exploitation of what's going on underground, you know, the coal, et cetera, is being dug out, right, from the past life that Earth had, because that's what fossil fuels are, right? I mean, they're all remnants of creatures and trees that lived a long time ago. We're going from that to the above surface kind of fuel that we can have, the sun,
Sure.
the wind. And this is a beautiful transition because it makes us go from, you know, this is a metaphor, like from the hell below to the sky above, right? I mean, this is the way we should. We are going to be creating a coexistence with what nature naturally is offering us, sunlight and wind, for example, as opposed to digging out from the inside of the earth stuff that is slowly kind of destroying our environment.
Totally agreed. I mean, the old systems, right? The extractive systems that we built that got us here in many ways,
Mm-hmm.
are now too costly. They're too heavy, and they are archaic, as you say, right? And it's interesting because, you know, what we are at a moment in time where the last 40 years we've made some mega technological leaps and bounds. You know, I talk about this with Rachel. One of our partners, Rachel Payne, is a world-renowned technologist and an AI expert, and we have these really deep conversations. And one of the things that we talk about, you know, driven from her experience, she was one of the founding team members at Google.org and has been kind of, you know, a stalwart in AI. She's built and sold many AI companies. So we have these deep conversations about technology, and we now are at a point where we are just seeing the parabolic rise of what technology can do, and how it can be applied to kind of the next chapter of humanity, right? What does a world look like when we don't have to extract oil and gas and refine it to make fuel or to make plastics, right? Like what does that world look like, and what technology can replace it? What's great is that the technology is already here and it's only getting better and better and better. And you know, one of the questions, it's kind of it sounds like a pithy question, but I think it's an important one, is what's the point of all this technology if it's not pointed towards solving big problems, right? If it's not pointed towards these big solutions that we can implement today that will help us address some of these big problems that are coming our way, or that are here, that have arrived at our doorstep.
Exactly, because, you know, people kind of forget, but the moral mission of science, at least in principle, is to alleviate human suffering. And so if we are not using our knowledge, our science and our technology with that in mind, then we are not doing science, you know, its due, because that is really what it's all about. And of course, there are all sorts of, you know, the Buddha said that wherever there is light, there is shadow, right? So of course, there is also the shadow side of things, and that's always going to be there. And in a sense, it should be there because you do need the tension. Nothing is perfect. You need the tension, you know, in order to be creative, so to speak. But on the other hand, you're right that the purpose is really not to exploit human nature, but to help us survive and improve our lives as a species. And you can think of, you know, one measure of that is life expectancy. And you go back 100 years and life expectancy was about a half of what it is now, right? And so why is this happening? Is it a miracle? No, it's not a miracle. This is happening because of the progress in medicine, you know, and all the technologies that go into the health sector. And I think that's extremely important to keep in mind. So it's wonderful that we are living in a time where we are seeing the flourishing of these new technologies. They are trying to use what the planet has to offer without having to pay the huge price of thickening our atmosphere with all sorts of bad stuff, right? And another thing that the COVID-19 is reminding us, well, two things is the animals are going rogue, right? Because human predators are not as present anymore. And the other one is that in places where you could not see the sky pretty much, now you can. It's a reminder that, you know, we do have a very visceral connection with the natural world. You know, what we have done, and I think it was necessary for a while, but it is not necessary anymore, it was a kind of, in order to grow as a civilization, we push nature out. You know, that's what cities do. They push nature out, right? They're basically an island of no nature, almost no nature. You have little parks here and there, and then people flock to them like crazy, right? And especially nowadays, can you imagine what would happen to Central Park if suddenly it gets open? It would be like a stampede, right? Because we need that. And I think this isolation that we're going through, and I'm very, very blessed because I live in nature, so I don't feel it as much as people in an urban environment. But this isolation is making it painfully clear to people that we need to be close to nature for our well-being, our emotional well-being. So if you put this all together, you know, the post-Copernicanism idea that is showing how precious and rare our planet is, and how fragile we really are within this ecosystem. You know, that a virus can threaten us in such horrible ways as to destroy or threaten to destroy so many of our social fabric in a very fundamental way. When you put this together with the role of science as a way of improving our lifestyles and decreasing human suffering, I think what this is pointing to is a really renewal of our relationship with our planet and with nature.
Mm-hmm.
And this is really what I think is the greatest opportunity that we have right now that would possibly help in this change of mindset. That people, it doesn't even matter where you come from or what you believe in, it is clear to everybody, painfully clear, that we are not designed evolutionarily to stay indoors, that we need the natural world. And once you understand that we need the natural world, you start to treat it better. And if you treat it better, then you start realizing, wait, what can I do as an actor, not as my government, the corporation? No, what can I do as a single person in order to preserve what we have? And that is where the consumer becomes the partner of the corporate ethics, because then the corporations that develop a new way of dealing with the environment, a new way of interacting with the production of whatever it is that they're making, will be captivating a larger and larger sector of the population that want to buy their products because they are more aligned with this new mindset. So I hope that there is kind of like this wave, you know, a growing wave of change, and that we're not going to revert back to where we were before this pandemic.
Yeah, I agree. I hope we're there too, or getting close. You know, conceptually, we call it climate primacy. And it's kind of a riff on the idea that in the 1960s, you know, Milton Friedman issued the directive with other economists that shareholder primacy was the kind of guiding principle of the day for corporates, right? That if you're a big corporation, you serve your shareholders first, and everything else comes second, including the environment, including the impact of your operations. So what you're describing is kind of flipping that model on its head, right? It's saying, hey, if you're a corporate actor, if you're an agency, a government, whomever, how you relate to the environment is going to matter for your partners, for your customer base that really cares about their impact by virtue of buying the product or buying the service. So I love it as a concept, and it's something that is really top of mind for us, as we're corporate actors too. And I just want to say something to your previous point about nature. So I'm currently in the West Village in New York City, thankfully safe, and it's been astounding to see how quickly nature has come back. So above my brownstone are two bald eagles that have been soaring and circling, and probably having a field day with all the little critters that they'll have for lunch. And it's just been an unbelievable kind of experience in seeing nature snap back when we give it just a little bit of space to breathe. So that's the good. But I want to, you know, you did a good job in tying this all together. And I want to kind of just make a numerical point that kind of shows us the need for what we need to rebuild. So we've seen in this slowdown an annualized decrease of greenhouse gas emissions of 5.5%. And that's what we're seeing out here in the clear skies and nature coming back. And so that sounds like a lot, and it obviously has a clear effect. But at the same time, what we know is to avert 1.5 degrees temperature increase, 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature increase by 2050, we have to decrease emissions by 7.5%. So even by basically shutting down a meaningful percentage of our global economy, we haven't even hit the threshold by which we would achieve the climate goal set by the UN and the IPCC of 7.5% decrease. And that's a compounding number. That's every year we have to decrease by 7.5% through 2050. So what it tells me is that the current systems are ill-equipped. They're ill-equipped for us to meaningfully make a dent in the climate crisis. And so the work that we've got to do is to rebuild more sustainable, more regenerative systems that can support that 7.5% decrease in emissions. And it gives us some perspective, because we've shut down a lot in our global economy and it's still not enough. So we've got some work to do in kind of reaching those numbers and those thresholds. And thankfully, I think consumers, politicians, corporates are seeing the effects of this little bit of a slowdown. And maybe that's convincing enough for all of us to put climate first, to have a climate primacy mindset for all of us, right? I think that would probably be a good goal for us to seek if we're to achieve the goal of 1.5 degrees or less temperature increase.
I think we need to, we meaning those who can mobilize resources and have some impact, we need to capitalize on this moment and really create a way of bringing this message to as many people as possible. Okay. Because again, it is the consumer that is going to determine the future of a corporation. If the consumers don't like, or that's how it should be, don't like the way a corporation is acting, they won't buy the product, the corporation is going to break. And I think you're beginning to see that even with the oil industry a little bit, with changes that are happening recently, very recently. In fact, I think today Bill McKibben published something in the New Yorker about this. And so more and more people, and that would go to schools and to kids, they're the ones that are going to inherit this mess. And you only change a mindset if you really have a powerful grassroots movement so that people can understand that this is not political. This is not about liberals versus conservatives. This is not about religious views. This is about the survival of our species as a whole, in this planet as we like it. Because, if things change, we'll still survive, but it's really going to suck big time. It's because when the environment changes, there'll be all sorts of very profound modifications on the climate, not just little things, but big things, like pests and new diseases because of the melting of the permafrost and what's coming out that is being buried there for thousands of years. So perhaps new pandemics from new stuff that we have zero idea about. So all these things are connected. And when people understand the connectivity and the fragility, they have to become a little more humble about how they approach this planet and life. So this is the lesson that I'm hoping that through all this pain and suffering and that we're experiencing right now, that people are going to learn and emerge from. That this is hopefully the dawn of a new era. That the world post-pandemic is not going to revert back to its old ways, but that people are going to be much more awakened and realize much more what's at stake and how important our relationship to the planet really, really is at the visceral level, not just in a practical, I like to go to the beach. No, it's much more than just that. It's about survival.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, you talk about kind of consumers and kind of the actors in our global economy. And what I want to say to our audience is investors will play a big role in this as well. What we said earlier is kind of what gets funded and what technologies we implement, many of which are ready today. We know lots of them, we're invested in lots of them. What we decide to build next will have implications for the next 100 or 1,000 years. And it's really heartening to know that there are others in academia, in science, and philosophy, like yourself, who share that mindset and can help us kind of bring folks over to the understanding that what we do here matters, and what we're all stakeholders in what happens next. And that's a really important message, and I'm really grateful that you're delivering it as well.
Yeah, so I think what you're doing is precisely recognizing the failure of the state to be the initiator of this transition to a new economy. And you're taking the future in your own hands, so to speak, right? And actually providing the funds and the opportunities for people with the right ideas, to try to be creative and change the way things are. This is not going to come from governmental grants, certainly not now. And so what you're doing is essentially, because you're empowering the revolution, so to speak, in a way that without groups like yours, it would be much, much harder to attain in the United States. Yeah.
Totally agreed. Well, I think we're approaching question time, and I want to make sure we get enough of them in. So I'm going to read a first question for you here, and let's see where we go. So this says, what steps do you take to discuss climate change or the impact of COVID with someone that confuses opinion for theory and denies data with very little technical background? So what do you say to someone who doesn't have the technical or scientific background, but confuses their opinion of not thinking that these are global issues for things that, for theory, right? How do they confuse opinion for theory? What do you say to those people?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because that's a question of the message, and how do you couch the message in a way that is actually understandable and effective, to people that may be outside of your cohort, or the circle of people that actually pay attention to this, right? And the way I react to that is that, well, there's one thing that we all share as humans, which is our love for stories. We all love stories. So what you do is you don't come from above and say, this is how it is because I say so and I have the authority to say so, because that kind of discourse doesn't go anywhere. But you say, let me tell you the story of who we are and how we got to the point where we are right now. And what are the consequences of what has been happening for 150 years or so of industrialization? And look at how the world is changing, And so you tell the stories, you focus not so much in the scientific data, because that's, not going to tell anything to these people, but you talk about the stories of some of the people that are just like them, but living in places that have been much more affected by what's going on, so that they can empathize with those people and understand the connection, the connectivity between us all. So it really is about telling the story right, and not just spitting out data or saying, but I have a PhD and you don't, so you should be listening to me, because that just does not work. That will rub people the wrong way. And so it's about humility, and it's about the recognition that everyone has the right to know, and it's just a matter of how you translate the story so that people can relate to it in a more personal level. It's not easy, but it's doable, right? And that's something that should be done. And it could start in schools. It could start with people visiting schools to tell stories about what does it mean, climate change, and talk about other climate changes that happened in the world in the past, how they affected our ancestors, and how this is completely different because it's anthropogenic as opposed to natural. And so there are ways of telling the story that people can relate to. And so that would probably be the best way to go for.
Yeah, I mean, you said something interesting that I want to make sure we highlight, which is empathy. This can be a great moment for us to increase the empathy we have for each other, and I think that'll make us less of a mindset of us versus them, and more of a mindset of we're one tribe on this tiny little rock hurtling through space.
Right? You always have empathy for the folks in your tribe. So once you understand that we are all in the same tribe, then hopefully we're going to have a global upsurge of empathy, where people are going to understand a little better that, hey, we're all in this together. And but It's a long
Great.
road, but it's a road that can be traveled.
Yeah, and I think we'll get there. I think we'll get there. All right, question two. It's a long one, so indulge me here. With regard to tribalism, how does the theory play out against the backdrop of COVID-19? I think we talked a little bit about that. In the United States, social inequities have been revealed and groups seem to be forming. Is there a deeper reason behind this? And how do we build the economy in a regenerative way when people are under stress?
Yeah, so the groups are forming because exactly our fundamental instinct is to group up in a tribe in order to survive. So I think that the formation of these groups is very much part of what has always happened to us. The way we always dealt with adversity is because united we win, right? And the question is how broad is this union, right? And you're absolutely correct. The person asked the question. I mean, whenever there is tremendous stress in society, the poor are the ones that are going to pay much more of a price. And that is already exposing the need that we have to kind of perhaps change. You know, I talk about post-Copernicanism. I think we have to go beyond Milton Friedmanism too. You know, I think post-Milton Friedman is kind of a corollary to post-Copernicanism in the sense that in the end, what matters is not the stockholders, but the consumers, you know, the people that are buying a product. And this shift is a shift that could completely change the paradigm of economics nowadays. And perhaps that's a good place to start. And where does that start? Well, it could start in the business schools, you know, so lots of business schools. Dartmouth has one called Tuck School of Business, one of the best in the world. And there are people now teaching corporate ethics, you know, and they're examining precisely how this change can be implemented so that you remain profitable, but you also remain more aligned, not with your stockholders necessarily, but with the people that are actually buying your product. And that's essential.
Yeah, it's you know, the role of ethics is a big one, right? And you know, we're going to stay as apolitical as possible, but I think we're looking at what happens when you don't have ethical leadership in parts of the world, and the effects that that can have on these global crises. And you know, when big things come up and we've got to move quickly, earnestly, in a globalized way, you need to have ethical leaders who can move on our behalf, right? Who can make smart and ethical decisions for us to get out of the situation that we're in.
Yeah, that's simple, you know, that put people's lives ahead of money.
Yeah.
And that
Great.
did not happen in this country. And we're seeing what's happening now. 1/3 of the cases are in the United States and 1/4 of the deaths are in the United States. And that's just tragic.
Yeah. All right, let's take one more question. What is the importance of K through 12 science and environmental studies programs?
Well, I love that question because that speaks to my heart. It is absolutely essential. And I think having a third grader at home right now, whom I'm partially homeschooling, you know, on top of everything else, I would say that schools do a good job talking about nature and what nature is, but they don't do a good job talking about nature and how we are completely dependent and related to nature. And these are very different conversations. You know, one thing is to say, look, let's go look at the birds, or look at how, you know, the chicks come out and grow, etc., or the bean in the cotton, you know, and you see it germinates, etc. That's all great, but there is very, very little conversation about the story of humanity in this planet. And that is a fundamental story that has to be told, you know, and very few people know that story. And that is perhaps one of the problems that we're facing. We don't know that story, so we do not understand how deeply related and codependent we are in not just with our environment, with all other life forms as well, right? Yeah. And it's great to talk about the bees, but you know what? Without bees and pollination, we wouldn't be eating very efficiently, you know, and there are all sorts of other connections that are not being highlighted in the school curricula that should be. So that is a very important point, and it's a point that I would hope that philanthropic help would come to perhaps sponsor talks and curricular changes to address these issues.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me, in this moment where many, if not most school children are home, we have an opportunity to rebuild and rethink what we're educating, what we're spending time on in terms of education, and how that can be delivered most effectively. How do you produce good and ethical and active citizens and stakeholders in the world as you educate them and educate folks about what's important? And we have an opportunity now to kind of reshape what that looks like. And it's an important one.
Very important. I agree 100%. Yeah.
All right. Last question. We've got 5 minutes left. I wish we had another hour, to be honest, but we've got 5 minutes left, and this one's a thoughtful one. It'll help us wrap up. So this topic we're discussing is so critical at this time. How can we publicize the content to our own networks? So how do we get the message out? There's, a couple hundred folks listening. There'll be a few thousand more with the recording. How do we get the message out so that this is something that sticks and that people can actually take it and act on it?
That is a great question, because I don't know if you guys remember, an hour ago, almost an hour ago, I started talking about the need for the changing of a mindset, right? And the only way you can do that is by talking to as many people as possible. But what I find is that there are lots of wonderful groups out there, like FullCycle. Yesterday, I was in a meeting with another kind of organization called the Garrison Institute, who is doing, and they do similar things, not with investment necessarily, but the idea of the need for a change in the mindset of how we relate to each other and the planet, about kindness, etc. And I said, what the problem is that we don't have a coalition, that there should be, just like you have the United Nations to talk about political issues, there should be a much broader coalition of foundations, investment groups. They have not exactly the same goals, but they have, in general, or at least a mission that has a lot of overlap. And if these people get together and self-organize into a much bigger group, right, sort of an umbrella organization, then the power multiplies by 1,000,000. And then the reach becomes enormous. And that, to me, is possibly one way of addressing this question of how do we kind of amplify the message that we are discussing now so that it can reach as many people as possible. Most importantly, the people who are not listening to us right now, because we want to reach those who do not tune into this, but those that go to other groups, so to speak, that will have perhaps a different message. So that is, to me, essential. This sort of the building of an umbrella coalition of different groups that would amplify the message together and perhaps help each other, improve and maximize their ability to promote change.
Yeah, I agree. I love that as a note that we're ending on. I will add that folks can go out and read your book, your latest book, The Simple Beauty of the Unexpected. That's a great way to understand our purpose, our place in nature and the universe. They can also go to marcelogleiser.com to read all of your really beautiful, thoughtful pieces and to see where you're speaking next. I want to make sure we get that out because your voice is an important one, and I'm so thankful that you were able to join us today for this conversation. Really special to have you, and I really appreciate your perspective, both as an academic, as a physicist, as a cosmologist, as a philosopher, and really as a global citizen and stakeholder in what happens here and what happens next as it pertains to the climate crisis and everything that we might face as one tribe. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Thank you, FullCycle, and thank you everyone that took the time to listen to us. Till next time.
Until next time. So thank you everyone for joining us. This has been The Future with FullCycle. We'll be doing so many more of these with more interesting minds and stakeholders, with more topics about how we can address the climate crisis in a thoughtful, meaningful way. My name is Stefan Nicolo. Really happy to have you here today. Thanks for everyone for joining us. Until next time.
See ya.